Dim shut the wooden door behind him. It closed with a satisfying thud, the latch securing it with a springy pop. He loved that sound and everything about his door. It had taken him several weeks to get the hotel to give it to him. Most bugs had a dirt clod to control the traffic through their room. Unlike a wooden door that could be swiftly closed, a clod had to be rolled from side to side to control traffic. Wood was much more practical. It was light, sturdy, and it had a nice smell. Dim grew so fond of the wood that he had his hotel room transformed into a wooden nest. It was a major process which included him being transferred to the wood section of the hotel where such applications were allowed. Even the thought of doing it again made Dim sigh. He was sent to the classifier multiple times to acquire a note of species and diet. The problem was that stag beetle was not readily known within the records of mud. One record said stags ate wood, while another said they did not. This led to his first note of species and diet, to declare that he probably would not eat wood. That word, probably, was the start of his troubles. The uncertainty of the note of species and diet made the hotel staff uneasy and suspect Dim of bribery. He was a wealthy master, after all. However, it was not acceptable to make such an accusation. Doing so would dash all chances of potential bribes in the future. So, the staff devised a plan. First, they gave him a decoration made out of wood and waited 2 weeks. After seeing that Dim did not eat the decoration, the hotel staff made plans to add more expensive wooden features. Eventually came the door. He promised them he would not eat it. The door's disappearance complicated things. Dim did not know how it disappeared, but he had his suspicions. Miss Touch, down the hall, had always eyed him as he came and went after the door was installed. She was always there peering at him from her own entryway, dodging behind her clod when she thought he saw her. One day, when returning to his hotel chamber, he found Miss Touch inspecting the grains on his door. He shooed the smaller beetle away, but she always came back at the oddest of times. His suspicions were only amplified later that night when he awoke to a loud scratching noise. He called out to see who or what was making the disturbance. The sound stopped for a brief moment, but then soon resumed. He investigated, worried that the noise had something to do with the ongoing ant siege. The sound grew louder as he approached his door, but stopped as he bumped into a pot. The pot's cracking caused scrambling claws outside of his room. Upon opening the door, he saw Miss Touch's door clod come to a stop, sealing her entryway. After several conversations where Dim insisted he did not eat doors, and a replacement door becoming very moist with someone's saliva, the decision was made to transfer Dim to the wooded section of the hotel. Once Dim had lived there with no incident for several more weeks, they started an incremental process of adding the rest of the wood paneling over the plaster. Now, as Dim crossed his lavish room painted in bright floral patterns which he had added, the glorious oak creaked under his steps. Even his chair complained with chirps as he sat in it. He breathed in deeply, welcoming the woody varnish smell and the squeaks he could make as he rocked in his seat. Unfortunately, he could not spend all his time enjoying his wooden nest, especially not now. He opened a desk cupboard and pulled out ink and paper. Laying out the supplies, he dipped his left claw into the ink and began to write. He was not the best writer, but his Scubbian script was beautiful. The process was more like drawing than he had realized back when he was illiterate and hoping to learn. Drawing he could do, but it was the complex memorization of patterns and symbols that eluded him. That was expected, as he had had difficult time remembering most things. The only issue he had now was remembering that he had wrote things down. Quill had recommended he keep his repetition up, rereading what he had written the previous day. The process had helped significantly. The problem then was finding time to review. Ever since he became a master of mud, Dim found that his escapades with flower documentation and exploration became increasingly restricted. Right now, however, was not a moment for the Masters, or even Mud. This was Dim's time. Despite an ongoing war, he had managed to sneak to the lookout tower. He told no one that he was not there looking for ants, though he kept an eye out for them. No, Dim was looking for something more precious, and he found it. Had he pulled out his journal and began writing, then he would have caused suspicions amongst the lookouts. So he had to walk, as a calm beetle would, back to his hotel room, then hurry to his desk to write what he had seen before his memory discarded the facts. East side of city, Dim wrote. Flower color. A knock thumped against Dim's door. The interruption made him stop and look toward the noise. He then looked back at his paper to read what he had written. He hadn't finished his thought. Dim wiped a claw down his face and sighed. I will not forget, he thought. The knocking sounded again. Dim stood and crossed the room, his entire apartment creaking in protest under his bulk. He opened his door just enough to peek out. He scrutinized the individual who stood there holding out a sealed letter with the Yal symbol stamped upon the black wax. Letter from Master Dim, the plump beetle said. She stood in flowing red robes that marked her as a messenger of the Masters. Messages carried by these deliverers were too important to leave to the typical delivery system. Dim opened his door all the way and reached for the letter. The messenger made a quick inhale and looked down at the floor, arms still extended. Dim barely noticed. It was typical for bugs to be a little shocked by him. He was massive compared to most. Every now and then, a bug could be as tall, but few could compare to his width. However, he knew his size was not the issue. Rather, his lack of clothing was the real problem to the eye-averted deliverer. He never understood why others wore clothes. Fabric mostly got in the way. He would see them walking along and notice them pulling at their nice, expensive clothes, trying to get their claws unstuck from the fabric. It wasn't their fault that claws were so good at gripping. The clothes were just too good at snagging. Clip, in many ways, agreed with Dim on this point. But Clip also wanted to blend into the crowds. To do that, he wore his robes. When he wanted to sneak, he would remove those clothes, since he, too, was nearly the shade of night himself. However, his new matte black robe, which he had started to call Shadow, had seemed to change Clip's old habits. Dim had rarely found Clip without it nowadays, at least before Clip left. To say Dim wore nothing was not entirely true. He often was found wearing a pack on his shell with many useful things that had to do with flowers and potions, or at least their documentation and gathering. The pack was never seen without a chest strap, a loop that went over his head on the topmost shoulder on one side and came down like a sash on the opposite side. It was riddled with pouches and loops to hold things. The last item about Dim's person that he was never without was a large sack longer than him. The sack contained a fabled beetle blade named Chell. Dim had lost Chell's clothes when he escaped from the ants. Now, as Master of the City's Defense, a title invented for him to oversee the siege defense of Mud, Dim never was without Chell or her temporary sack covering. Master Dim, the messenger said, still looking at the ground, Master Clip wanted me to confirm that it is you that received the letter. Dim accepted the note. Thanks, he said. With a bow, the messenger turned and abruptly walked off. Dim walked back to his room, the creakiness of the floorboards orchestrating his movements. He sat the letter from Clip down on his desk, broke the seal, and began to read. Dim. The new growing side is going better than we had hoped. The soil recommendations you made caused significant progress in speed and quality of the growth and nectar production. The first batch has been harvested and fermentation is nearly complete. I should have a shipment to Mud soon. Hopefully it's not too late. We appear to be unnoticed, but I'm not certain of that yet. Likely not. I made contact with Quill yesterday. He's well. We made some visits. No luck yet. Please send an update on Mud. Any news on the potion production in Mud? What was wrong with the soil? I'm sure Nax did it. I just don't know how. Sammy and Mamie are doing well. Sammy practically runs the place without me. I'm not sure I was needed here, but I wouldn't have let them go alone, so it works out either way. I have realized how mature they've gotten. They were full size for lady beetles before I left, and I only realized that they weren't little anymore while I've been here. Oh, and the voice says to say hello for him. So, hello from the voice. I found out that my father has been dead now for some time. Even though the voice sounds like him, it isn't him. I have some plans to get to the bottom of what the voice actually is, and if it's harmful or not. So far, he's mostly been decent company. He's had both his positives and negatives. Anyways, there is a physician I've heard of here, and he's supposed to be good with this sort of thing. I'll be seeing him. Hopefully I'm able to leave East City soon, and the operation to another. Not the girls. Someone else. I don't like this place. If possible, I'll personally deliver the first shipment. I have someone I'd like you to meet. She's anxious to meet you. Clip. Dim smiled. The recommendation for the soil was correct, but why had the flowers in Mud stopped growing? He was not sure. The soil was in supreme condition to grow those plants. Now it was dead. Even the small life failed to wriggle about. And where did all those clumps come from? The fact of the matter was, no one had time to investigate into who the saboteur was or how it was achieved. If they could not produce potions in Mud, then the East City was their best option. There, with a secret garden, they could produce many potions outside of the view of spies. There they could grow beautiful flowers. And that reminded him. Dim turned to the page he was writing on earlier, before he had received the letter. Dipping his claw in the ink so he could finish his sentence, he read what he had written originally to remember where he had left off. Yes, Dim said to himself. He added an additional symbol when another knock at his door startled him. He looked at the door, then down at his paper, and then back at the door. He sighed. Why is the door so noisy? He said. With another heavy sigh and wiping of his face, Dim trekked back to his front door. The room seemed to creak in a manner that reminded him that he had just made this trip only moments before. The messenger was not the same. This one, male, was less embarrassed by Dim's apparent nakedness, but still slightly put off by it. He reached into his oversized pocket, full to the brim with a thick stack of letters, rummaged around and retrieved a letter. He handed it to Dim. The messenger barely said thank before the door was shut. Dim could hear the messenger swearing over the flies and the steamy piles of the gods beyond the door. Dim did not care. Today was the first day he had gotten away from the masters in some time. He needed his time to get a clear head, to get the observations written down. Even Dim needed space, especially Dim. Peace, Dim thought, trying his mentor's advice. He walked back to his seat at his desk. As he listened to the chirping of the wood around him, he smiled. The chair accepted Dim's mass, but not without complaint. He rocked back and forth, examining the letter. The letter bore a bronze-colored wax seal. The seal was the same symbol for knowledge, the symbol Vok. Dim had received many letters from Quill since he left with Clip for the East City. He broke the seal and opened the letter. Master Dim, your last letter was acceptable. Remember to write Moth with the appropriate flourish. Dim smiled. It had been several months of effort on Quill's part to get Dim to put the right texture and flair on Moth. Quill said it was the last character Dim had to perfect before he could graduate from beginner writing. Dim knew how to write Moth. He just didn't. It had taken him a lifetime to find a writing and reading teacher, and he was certain that there was more Quill would teach him. As such, He was not willing to pass the test that would graduate him and allow Quill to no longer be his entry-level writing and reading instructor. So, in every letter, Dim purposely wrote Moff without texture or flair. Due to Quill's exactness and self-imposed principles, he would not allow Dim to pass until he had perfected the last Scubbian character. Dim found that fortunate. This meant he could keep his instructor as long as he needed. To pass and graduate, please see that you texturize the character appropriately and add the flair. I met with Clip the other day. The plantation's production has been astounding. Likely, provisions will be ready soon. If I have achieved my purpose in being here, I surely will return on the first delivery. If not, then I shall stay until my query is achieved. The political atmosphere here in East City is both complex and agitating. I have petitioned several chancellors here, their fancy word for master, but none will consider aiding Mud against the ant siege. My pleas fall on deaf antennae and deaf ears. The shells on these chancellors are harder than anything I've seen in Mud. In short, it's all proceeding as expected. I will continue to petition all of the chancellors down to the last one. I do not believe that, in our current situation, we will be able to sway them. The fear of the ants is great in East City. They would rather sidestep this issue altogether and let us die in silence in our little corner of the world. Still, there is hope. As Clip's shipments allow Mud to successfully defend against the ants, I believe we can win over some of the chancellors of East City. They are not compassionate, but they will aid us if they find that we are strong. Clip's shipments should be the strength we need. I inform each I speak with that we had 3 stag beetles defending Mud, but they do not believe me. When I mention the potions and the tactical advantage they give, they all listen more closely. I suspect that will be key to winning them over. I get the overwhelming impression that if we beat the ants due to the potions, we will have the politicians waiting in line to speak with us. I am scheduled to visit the Reber Hall soon. I doubt they will aid us. Many have petitioned the Reber to aid their cause before us, and all have met disappointment. Still, I shall not use others' failures as an excuse from my own attempt. Here are a few examples of Moff. Copy them exactly, and then we can graduate you from entry-level writing. Quill. Dim rested his arms on his desk. From the way that Quill carried on, it seemed rather hopeless that Mud would gain aid from the East City. But Dim could not blame them. The ants had spread rumors that Mud was already willing to attack East City. While this was not entirely false, it was not the mind of the citizens to do this. In fact, it was placed into motion by some previous masters of Mud who took counsel from the ants. Those leaders were now dead. Somehow, a rather violent and carnivorous plant, scent of death, was let loose in their holding cell one night. Nothing remained of the old masters who had plotted against East City except for small bits of shell that somehow escaped the acid that was placed in the pit once the scent of death had had its fill. All the same, no aid would come from East City unless Dim shared the potions he had been creating. Unfortunately, those potions had run out, and all attempts to regrow them in Mud had failed, likely thanks to Nax. Hopefully the work Clip attempted in the East City would fix things. Dim shook his head. He set the letter aside. Now he could at long last finish his thought on paper. He dipped his claw in the ink and prepared to write. He realized he had forgotten to wipe his claw clean from the last message delivery, as shown by the multitude of ink stains trailing on the wood floor all the way to the handle of his door and back to his desk. He ignored the mess and turned to his paper. He would not be distracted again. With obsidian claws dipped in blue ink, Dim went to write. His claws started to form the cell to place the last word in. He began to write when pounding on his door broke the squeaky silence of his rocking chair. "Go away," Dim called at the door. He had to focus. The word was on his mind. He just had to write it down. He strained his head, attempting to keep the memories inside. Thump, thump, thump came the knocking again. "Busy," Dim called back to the door. "Master Dim, there is trouble on the Council of Masters again." Dim stood and walked to the door. His claw trailed blue ink after him. "In the Mound of Masters?" he said. Outside of his door stood another messenger, again in red robes. Her eyes bespoke of desperation. Mellish was a good guard and messenger who understood what Dim was going through. "I don't think they can figure this one out, Master Dim," she said. "Please come." "Lead," Dim said. He followed Mellish out of his room. Dim closed the door to his wooden nest behind him. It squeaked as it moved on its hinges before the latch set, and his wooden nest was shut off from the rest of the world with its unfinished paper on the flower he had spotted earlier. He would have to finish that another time. Right now, Mud needed him. The flower would keep, he hoped, but the Masters of Mud would not.